So this is me again, Dr. Charles Miller. You've probably already seen the video now with Hugh White. If you haven't, I strongly recommend that you go on to it. So now I'm going to give you my top 10 tips for writing. Okay? Number one tip, which comes from Steven Pinker and which you've probably heard about in the interview that I did with Hugh, is the idea of the classical style. Okay? So you want to think that what you were doing is having a conversation with an intelligent person about something that you know, that you have spotted essentially, but which is not apparent to that person as yet. What you're doing is simply standing there and pointing it out to them. Okay? If you start off from this viewpoint, you're not going to go too far wrong in writing. Okay? Second point, which also comes from Steven Pinker, is to be aware of the curse of knowledge. Now, the curse of knowledge simply refers to the phenomenon by which it's very difficult for an individual who knows something to put themselves in the position of someone who does not know that thing. Okay, so just always be aware that there may be many things that you have learned that are second nature to you that are not necessarily going to be second nature to the person that you're writing for. Okay, now one of the ways to guard against this is to get your friends or relatives, partner, whoever, intelligent people who don't necessarily know very much about your subject, to read over your drafts and see whether it's clear to them. If it's not clear to them, then that's quite possibly a sign that you're suffering from the curse of knowledge. And if you find that this is the case, then what you should do is to redraft it again and again until it's actually clear to them. Okay? So that's tip number 2. Tip number 3 is something which I personally think lies behind a lot of bad writing, and it's this. People are attempting to cover their, let's call it posterior, okay, given that this is a family show. What I mean by this is that they're really worried about criticism. They're really worried about being exposed as not being a very smart person, their ideas not being very good, and so they deliberately write in quite an unclear style to make it harder for people to criticize them and to make it easy for them to say that they didn't actually mean what it appears they meant. Okay, so make sure that you do not do this. Bear in mind the words of a famous physicist who once said that one of his opponents was not even wrong. And by this I mean that there's a kind of a hierarchy in academic writing, and the best thing obviously is to be clear and right. However, the second best thing is not to be unclear and right. The second best thing is to be clear and wrong. Okay? If you're clear and wrong, at least then there's something to work with. There's room for improvement, there's room for feedback. But if you're unclear, there's really nothing that we can do to help you move your work forward. Okay? So don't try and cover your posterior, don't be afraid to be wrong. Okay? Now, related to this, it'll be much easier for you to avoid covering your posterior if you look on each piece of assessment not as being a referendum on your intelligence or a sort of an IQ test, and more as a reflection of the effort that you put in. So if you do badly, if you're called out for something, that doesn't mean to say you're not smart, that means to say you just need to put in a little bit more effort. And conversely, if you do well, that doesn't mean to say that you're a genius who doesn't have to try. That's a reward for the good effort you put in, but you'll only be able to maintain that if you continue good effort in the future. Now, psychologists talk about individuals who have an entity theory of achievement, and people who have an incremental theory of achievement. Now, the entity theory of achievement is that achievement is a result of your innate talents that you were born with. The incremental theory is that it's a result of your effort. Now, guess who does better, holding constant other factors, at learning things? Is it the people who believe that intelligence, or rather achievement, is about an entity, or is it about people who believe that achievement is about effort, that it's incremental? Well, surprise, surprise, it's people who believe it's incremental. If they do badly, they realize they can just work harder next time and do well. If they do well, they realize they have to keep working hard to do well in the future. Okay? Tip number 5, go easy on the jargon. Don't think that you can impress your professor by using an awful lot of highfalutin words that are going to bamboozle people, okay? That's not the way that you do well. Certainly not with me, and hopefully not with any of my colleagues either, okay? So it may very well be the case that your professor is actually not even aware of a lot of the jargon terms that you use, okay? So in a lot of cases, professors may be trained in different disciplines, they may be trained in different parts of the world where the jargon terms are different. And even if they're not, it's still a good idea to get out of the habit of using jargon, because if you're trying to communicate with the outside public, with policymakers, etc., jargon is going to confuse them and put them off. And when I say jargon, I don't just mean academic jargon, I also mean business jargon, public service jargon, military jargon, all kinds of jargon. Keep them to a minimum. If you have to use them, define them first and then use them after that, but don't use them ever without defining them. And the same goes for TLAs, that's 3-letter acronyms, okay? So any of those kind of things, if you have to use them, define them first before you keep using them in an undefined fashion, okay? So tip number 6, if you can cut a word out, always cut it out. Now, this rule comes from one of the finest writers in the English language, George Orwell, so there's got to be something to it. Word limits are an essential test of your skill as a writer. They're not just arbitrary rules. Don't think of them as suggestions. They are, in actual fact, cliffs. So make sure that you keep underneath word limits, and that often involves going back in and cutting out words like very, to a great extent, etc. Words that can be cut out without really changing the meaning of what you're saying. Okay? Tip number 7, go easy on subclauses. Now, for those of you who can't remember too much about the high school grammar that you might have done, subclauses are parts of a sentence like this one, okay? The car which I saw yesterday was grey. The which I saw yesterday is a subclause, okay? Now, the problem is that subclauses put a big strain on your reader's working memory and make it hard for them to follow the whole sentence. It means that people have to basically go back and then try and remember what it was that you said in the first place, okay? So be very careful. If you find you're using lots of subclauses, see if you can't split them into a shorter sentence instead, okay? So, tip number 8, structuring your essays. Always remember, introduction, body, conclusion. That bit's quite simple. Question is, how do you structure the body? There's many ways to do it, but in academic prose, what I like to do is to structure it as though it's a courtroom, okay? You have 2 opposing points of view, or maybe multiple opposing points of view. From your own research, you've figured out which point of view is correct. So basically what you're doing is you're getting 2 lawyers, or a succession of lawyers, to argue their case for each one of the different theories, and then at the end of it you're coming in with the lawyer for the best theory, demolishing the rest of the arguments and putting forward the evidence for the argument you find most convincing. Okay, that's the way that I like to do it, and that's the way I think would be a very good way to do or to structure any kind of research essays, book reviews, etc. Okay? So, tip number 9, use concrete examples. The human mind is concrete, not abstract. It thinks in visual images, it does not think in abstract concepts. And virtually any concept, no matter how abstract it may appear, can usually be expressed in terms of a visual image. I remember when I was doing mathematics classes, professors explaining calculus to me with the concept of hills and the tops of hills and looking around them, etc. So no matter how abstract you think a concept is, it can always be explained with a really good visual image. And in fact, there are writers who say that an explanation without an example is not an explanation at all. Okay, so make sure that when you're defining an abstract concept, you give a concrete example to make it real for your reader. Okay, so that's a very, very important tip. And tip number 10, just coming to the end here, try and read as much as you can of good reading. Now, Hugh talked about reading writers that you find really good, thinking about what it is that you like about them and then trying to copy those things. And I totally buy that. But it's also a good idea, if you have time, this is not a required reading by any means, but if you've got time, read some people who write about writing. Read Steven Pinker, read Richard Dawkins, his review of a book by a guy called Sokal and Brickmo on Nature, read George Orwell, Politics in the English Language, and read my former department head Mike Munger on How to Write Badly in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Read these things, think about it, take it on board.